the nation in responsible environmental policy since 1898. We have a long history of convening forums of candidates for key public offices. We are delighted to partner with the Boston Globe to host this critical discussion. While we traditionally gather in person, this virtual format allows us, for the first time, to offer live translations into Spanish. To listen to Ada Martinez live translate, please click the button labeled Interpretation below. Boston is on the front lines of climate change. How we respond to it will define our future. Our ability to thrive depends on our mayor protecting our infrastructure, improving air quality and human health, transitioning to renewable energy, and reckoning with centuries of environmental injustice. This last year has brought into sharp focus the importance and intersectionality of climate issues with economic, public health, and environmental justice issues. So today, we'll hear from the 6 leaders vying for your vote to lead this great city. In alphabetical order, they are Boston's former Chief of Economic Development, John Barros, Boston City Councilor, Andrea Campbell, Acting Boston Mayor, Kim Janey, Boston City Councilor, Anissa Asaibi George, Massachusetts State Representative, John Santiago, Boston City Councilor, Michelle Wu. Our moderators today will be Boston Globe journalists, David Abel and Milton Valencia. We have a lot to cover, and we will be strict and consistent with timekeeping. Each candidate has at most 60 seconds to respond to each question, and we'll have 2 lightning rounds in which candidates will be asked to respond with 20-second answers. I will be back halfway through to share some audience questions. So for those listening, please submit your thoughts in the Q&A box below. There will be no opening statements from candidates, but the forum will end with a closing statement of 60 seconds or less. We look forward to an insightful discussion. Thank you to our candidates for joining us. Now over to you, David and Milton.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And so great to see you all. We deeply appreciate you being with us on behalf of the Boston Globe and ELM. Thank you again. And we look forward to hearing your views on these very important issues. So in lieu of an opening statement, we thought we'd start with this open-ended question. What makes you the best candidate to lead the city on climate and environmental justice issues? We're going to go in alphabetical order with this first question, and then we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order with the following questions. So we'll do our best to try to balance the time. You'll have a minute to respond to each to this question. And again, when you get to 10 seconds before that minute, we'll be flashing something in the chat. So Chief John Barros, please start.
David, thank you for the question. I want to thank ELM and the Boston Globe for convening us for such an important topic. Climate change is really important for the mayor moving in, and clearly in Boston, we're already experiencing the impact of climate change. But those impacts impact different communities and different demographics in our city. And our most vulnerable, our seniors, our low-income residents, our people of color, those with disabilities, and residents living in certain health conditions are impacted first and worst. I've seen these disparities firsthand play throughout my life, and it's why I became a community organizer very early on. My first activity was a community cleanup, and then I became an organizer with the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, where I did work to push for environmental justice. I grew up in Roxbury, and our neighborhood was treated like the city's dumping ground. In the 1990s and 2000, my neighborhood had the highest rate of asthma, the highest rate of trash transfer stations in the city. It wasn't a coincidence. We talked about environmental justice. We talked about environmental racism. Then we launched a Don't Dump on Us campaign to make sure we fought illegal trash dumping and clean up resident lots and empowered people to push for a clean, just neighborhood. As mayor, I'm prepared to continue to fight for our people in all neighborhoods and use my background to do so.
Okay, thank you, Chief Barros. Councilor Campbell, you're on mute.
You would think I would know that by now, but thank you for having me. And of course, thank you for hosting this important conversation. Climate change, of course, is real, and we know that environmental injustices have existed in the city of Boston for generations. I grew up experiencing them in Roxbury. And of course, Roxbury still has some of the highest asthma rates in the Commonwealth. I'm still experiencing them as a resident of Mattapan. So I have always seen this to be a personal issue for me and exercised and worked with a sense of urgency to solve for these issues. I am proud that as council president, I led the way in terms of making sure that we passed the most aggressive climate agenda in the history of the city of Boston. That leadership would continue. That sense of urgency, centering communities of color is very important to me and has been a part of my track record from the beginning. Operating with a sense of urgency, of course, and making sure that in responding to these issues, it's with specificity. So I encourage folks, frankly, to take a look at all of my policy plans on my website, andreacampbell.org, because 60 seconds will never be able to cover it. But most importantly, it's action, intentionality, and always centering equity in communities of color with respect to these issues.
Thank you. And let me just underscore that again. Obviously, these are really difficult questions, and unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time. And so apologies with 6 candidates. We're going to try to pack in as much as we can. And we all understand that these are, there's a lot more to this. Councillor Cite George, please.
I told you the dog would make his appearance, and here he is. Thank you very much for having me today. My name is Anissa Cite George, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about what's before us. I believe that Boston can lead on a climate response and on climate justice. We need to. Those in leadership have a moral obligation to be bold on climate action and fight for the future of our communities. I'm ready to take on that responsibility as your mayor, to be bold and practical about the work ahead by cutting emissions, investing in green jobs, promoting a green economy, preparing our coastlines for sea level rise, and growing our tree canopy equitably across every single neighborhood. Most importantly, I'll lead on climate action with a community-based approach to ensure that each and every resident has a seat at the table. And I really do mean everyone, because for far too long, our frontline communities whose health and safety has been at most at risk has been left out of these discussions. We need to steer the conversation back to the communities across our city who are most disproportionately impacted by climate. It's what I've done as a city councilor, and it's what I'll continue to do as your mayor. Thank you very much for today's invitation. Look forward to continued discussion.
Thank you, Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much, David. I want to start by thanking ELM and the Globe for hosting this important conversation. You know, I see environmental justice as a racial justice issue. For far too long, Black and Brown communities have had to bear the brunt of the burden with no benefit. And I saw this firsthand growing up in Roxbury. I saw the devastation of our community when houses were torn down to make way for a highway. Thankfully, the community organized to stop that. I saw this when our access to public transit was taken from us in terms of the Orange Line elevated train. These issues are deeply personal to me, and I'm already leading in the city of Boston. Very proud of the appointment of my new chief of environment, energy, and open space, and the work that we are doing together. This will require that all of us, that the community, that residents, particularly those who are deeply, deeply impacted, and that means poor communities of color in particular, are at the table and have a front seat to this work, and that they are driving the agenda. That is the work that is already underway as mayor of Boston, and I look forward to continuing to work with residents and advocates in this space moving forward. Thank you again.
Thank you. Rep. Santiago.
Thank you, David, and thank you, ELM and Boston Globe, for hosting this important forum. As someone who grew up in underserved neighborhoods and who still provides medical care for patients who have fallen victim to the public health consequences of environmental justice, I mean, this issue is very personal to me. The problems caused by air pollution, unsafe water, unhealthy living conditions, they will manifest in my emergency room. And COVID has only made that worse. For example, one of the reasons we saw a higher hospitalization rate in Black and Brown communities was because they were a little more likely to have comorbidities with things like asthma, all higher in communities of color, in communities facing environmental justice issues. And that's why as mayor, I will prioritize equity, everything I do. And that starts with actively working to reverse long-standing, environmental justice issues in communities of color. They should, and they need to be at the table with any infrastructure or any development that happens in their neighborhoods, So I'll lead, and I'll especially, focus on these communities to incentivize green, sustainable infrastructure investments. I'll prioritize their inclusion, and I will make sure that they're at the table. And I'm looking forward to being a part of this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wu.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the hosts for today's conversation. I'm grateful for the chance to really get a deep dive into this incredibly urgent foundational climate issue for our city. It's one that's deeply personal for me. My older son was born in my very first year on the council, December 2014. I remember being shocked at that time of the year to learn that that was the hottest year ever on record for our world, right? 200 plus years of record keeping. The next year, again, a shock when he turned 1, that again, it was the hottest year on record, shattering last year's. Now, my son's 6 years alive on this planet have been our 6 hottest years on record. This is an urgent issue. I'm proud to have the vision at the scale and urgency that we need to put forward the first city-level Green New Deal anywhere in the country, a vision that's been endorsed by Bill McKibben, Sunrise Boston, and so many other climate leaders, because this is not about just what I'll do, but what I've delivered. I'm proud to have led the charge in coalition to do some of the biggest things that Boston could have done when we were told to be impossible to deliver: community choice energy, renewables, and I'll make sure we keep building coalitions to get these big changes done at the scale we need.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move into individual questions. You'll each have 1 minute to respond. Mayor Janey, the Green Ribbon Commission calls for the city to cut 50% of its emissions by the end of this decade. How far along are we now? And can you guarantee as mayor that we'll achieve that goal? And if so, how would we do that?
We have to continue to reduce our carbon footprint, make sure that we are building our capacity in terms of renewable energy, and we have to make sure that we are moving many more people onto different kinds of modes of transportation, whether pedestrians, whether bikes, and more rideshare opportunities. We are just going in the wrong direction now, but the work that we have in place, whether it is our infrastructure building, is helping us get there. I'm really proud, again, of the work that I am doing with my new chief around making sure we're dealing with the heat islands. We've got to make sure that we are doing retrofitting in terms of our buildings. We're already engaged in a process for new buildings going forward to make sure that they're energy efficient and that we are building green. But in terms of what we've already built, Boston is a very old city. So we do have to look at retrofitting our buildings and doing work there in an equitable way so that we are not hurting small landlords, and we're giving people the time and the resources needed to do this work. We can all get there if we work together.
Thank you. Councillor Wu, you've proposed achieving carbon neutrality for the city by 2040, 10 years before the Green Ribbon Commission, the city's climate action plan, or the state's new climate law calls for. You've also proposed a net zero municipal footprint by 2024. First, can you tell us what that means, and how do you propose achieving both goals without overburdening taxpayers?
We can't afford to aim for that long-term goal. We know that if the entire world gets our emissions under the right threshold by 2050, instead of sooner than then, we'll have just a 50-50 chance for the planet to remain livable, given all of the cycles that the tipping points that occur. I don't want my kids, I don't want any of our kids and grandkids to have just a coin flip's chance at survival in this city and on our planet. So we need to be as aggressive and ambitious as possible. It's about electrifying everything, cleaning the sources of electricity, and then ensuring we're changing our land use patterns to match that. Boston has to start with what we have at hand. Completely retrofit our own city buildings, a huge footprint with City Hall itself that we've already started plans to think about energy efficiency and how to reduce those emissions, get solar panels up, ensure that in our new permitting, we're not allowing buildings to go up that we'll have to force to retrofit in just a couple of years from now. We have to be as aggressive as possible to think about the long-term plans for our city because the impacts are already here.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell, you've called for establishing a conservation corps. Can you tell us what that would do, how many people you envision it would include, and how much you expect it to cost the city?
Thank you for the question. And the goal of this is, of course, to realize the fact that there is greater investment from both the state and the federal government with respect to our response to climate and making sure every neighborhood is resilient in the face of it. And making sure that, of course, jobs and other things are available, particularly in our environmentally injustice communities. So the Conservation Corps is an idea of being able to actually bring together folks, and there's still time to figure out what the investment would be. And frankly, we should have all the investment that is necessary for bringing together folks with the hopes of not only creating jobs, but also looking at the metrics we use to track some of these environmental injustices in communities, air pollution, lead, and responding with solutions that combat it. And so how do we respond? By creating jobs, creating opportunity, making sure that communities, particularly communities of color, are included in the conversation. This is designed to be inclusive and one strategy to get us there. I don't know where I am on time because it's in the chat. But I will also add, I live in Mattapan. I was shocked to learn, for example, some of our climate maps did not include my neighborhood of Mattapan. So this is supposed to do that, but also, of course, everything in my plan centers communities of color.
Thank you. Chief Barros, you talk about increasing transportation options such as bus and ferry service. Given that those still mainly use fossil fuels and are likely to do so for some years to come, how would that affect your plans to achieve carbon neutrality?
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. We know that when it comes to carbon emissions, that 70% of our emissions come from our buildings. And so we need to continue to focus on buildings. We absolutely need to continue to focus on transportation, but buildings are in fact where we need to do more work. Now on transportation first, let's make sure we take advantage of this historic opportunity to work with the Biden administration to make sure that we have clean transit system and expand our transit system, make sure people can use it. But it's about buildings. And first, as mayor, I'll make sure that we continue to invest in energy efficient and carbon neutral buildings. We've already spent $45 million in energy efficiency and renewable energy investments in our buildings through the Renewable Boston Trust. I will make sure to expand that. I will make sure to accelerate the city's commitment to go carbon neutral in all of our buildings. And we can do it a lot faster. We need to do more in terms of electrical vehicles. The country's doing a lot more and we need to follow that. As mayor, the commitment would be to do buildings first while we're doing transit.
Thanks. Councilor Savvy-George, you've been outspoken about education issues and modernizing school infrastructure. Do you support electrifying the school bus fleet, which emits a significant amount of pollution that has a serious impact on our kids? And if so, how long do you expect it to take if you become mayor?
No, thanks for the question, and thanks for including the conversation around education, how important our education system is, both to thinking about training for green jobs of the future and the role that our buildings can play right now. As we know, 70% of our city's buildings, all buildings in the city account for the challenges that we face, and 50% of those are publicly owned business buildings. And we know that our schools are a huge part of our facilities, of our assets here in the city of Boston. Of course, I will push the state to expand both what they're doing at the T, and we can play a role in what we're doing in the Boston Public Schools with our school bus fleet. It is so important that we do that. The climate response has to be rooted in transit. And as leader of the city and thinking about our school bus fleet, we can be a leader in that effort and need to do it for sure. And I'm committed to it as mayor of the city. How long do you expect it would take? That has to do obviously with the terms of our lease agreements with our fleet. We don't own our buses, or we actually own our buses, but as we recycle through them and add buses to our fleet, we can do it over, I'd say, a period of 3 to 5 years, maybe 10, again, depending on our ability to invest. And I think we can lean on the Biden infrastructure dollars to do some of that. We will certainly invest with some of our capital dollars to do that. But it is a long road ahead for sure, no pun intended, or the pun maybe is intended.
Thank you. Rep. Santiago, you don't appear to have a climate plan or otherwise address environmental issues on your website. Can you tell us why and what would be your top 3 priorities?
Thanks, David, for the question. It's because we're releasing plans every week for the next 6-7 weeks. We started with Mass and Cast last week. We'll be moving forward the next coming weeks, and I look forward to sharing my climate agenda with you. And let me just say, I've been a proud advocate for climate issues since I've stepped into the State House. That's why I was proud to support and vote for the 2050 Climate Roadmap Bill on Beacon Hill, which is one of the most progressive pieces of state legislation in this entire country. And one of the first things we did was we set a goal to get us to carbon neutrality by 2050, setting benchmarks along the way, right? And as mayor, I'm going to do everything I can to do that, right? And that focuses on cutting emissions in 2 sectors. First and foremost, the development sector and transportation. When it comes to development, I think you're absolutely right. What folks have said, we have an issue right now with the existing development that's currently happening in the city of Boston. I want to reimagine how we make new buildings and we put them forward and make sure that they use sustainable materials and that we prepare for infrastructure that is all about electrification. And secondly, we need to retrofit what we have right now in the city of Boston, where we've said, we have 2 people who've said 70% of our emissions come from what we currently have in stock. We need to address that by retrofitting that. And I'm committed to incentivizing folks to do just that with a fund. When it comes to transportation, I will electrify the city's fleet. I will support the expansion of electric vehicles, and I want to expand public transit options across the city of Boston. I don't own a car, David. I take public transportation. I walk, I take a bike, I talk the talk, and I'm going to walk the walk as the mayor of Boston.
Okay, thank you. All right, this is a question for everyone. Over the past few decades, the city has spent billions of dollars building up the seaport without building codes that would ensure the new glass towers and other infrastructure could withstand the massive flooding that sea rise and strengthening storms are likely to bring in the coming years. Was it a mistake for the city to spend so much money building up a neighborhood on landfill and at sea level? If so, what went wrong and who do you blame? And do you have any larger concerns about how development there is still proceeding? This time we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order. So Councillor Wu, please start.
Thank you. The seaport is one of the starkest examples of what's wrong with our development system overall. We have a parcel by parcel approach where individual buildings are granted exceptions to a long outdated zoning code without clear baselines for not just climate resiliency, but affordability, transportation access, and how all the things that our residents need fit together in their day-to-day lives. In the seaport, we see that not only was a tremendous amount invested publicly, it doesn't feel like the waterfront access that our residents deserve. Not one Black homeowner got a mortgage there with all of the new luxury residential development. Not too long ago, the private sector was talking about investing more than $100 million to build a gondola system for those who could afford tickets to fly out of the traffic because our transportation planning has fallen so far short of being integrated. We need an economic development plan that is closely tied with our housing plan, our transportation and climate plan, and all of that has to have a baseline of affordability for our residents.
Thank you, Rep. Santiago.
Great, thanks, Dave. The seaport is an example which we cannot continue, right? And we need to move forward. And as the next mayor of Boston, I look forward to making sure that any new development in the Boston really takes into account climate change, right? Because climate change is the existential threat to our world and to our city. Sea levels are rising. We have a disappearing tree canopy. We have heat islands that are impacting our health, threatening our livelihoods, not just our current livelihoods, but those of our future residents in the city of Boston. And we need a mayor who understands that, who understands the physical consequences of climate change, right? And I will act with urgency with respect to climate resiliency, because that's what we're talking about at the seaport with respect to its proximity to the shoreline, right? And we need to have a mayor who's going to mitigate those irreversible effects of climate change, right? And so I want to work with stakeholders to really put forth climate resiliency standards in development, construction, and any new infrastructure in the city of Boston. We have a 43-mile waterfront, and this is a once in a generation opportunity to really expand green space and park space, really using shoreline resiliency measures and opportunities to expand our green space. And as mayor of Boston, I'm going to leverage our fiscal status to make sure that we are investing in changes that can really uplift the waterfront and to really avoid what's happening in the seaport.
Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much. When it comes to the seaport, so many things went wrong, and I'm not sure that it is helpful to point fingers of blame now, but we can look at just the creation of a new neighborhood that did not have equity in mind when it was created, in terms of who built it, in terms of who lives there now, in terms of the businesses that are there. We do have an opportunity moving forward when it comes to our waterfront. Boston is a coastal city. It's a great world-class city. And we have to do much more to protect access to the water. We have to make sure that there is green space on the water. When I look at the rest of the waterfront, the Harbor Garage project is another example of let's not repeat what happened on the seaport and continue down that path, but instead, let's say no and ensure that that there is much more resiliency as we do look at the waterfront all across Boston. And so, I think it is really important that we don't repeat those mistakes, though not really helpful to point fingers at blame at this point.
Okay, we'll delve a little more deeply into some of those questions a bit. Councilor Sabi George.
Thank you. I think he hears my name coming and he knows it's up. I think we've learned a great deal from what's happened at the seaport, and those lessons learned have to be applied as we're thinking about development across the rest of our city. When we think about East Boston, when we think about Dorchester, when we think about downtown and the North End and Charlestown, we must carry out a thoughtful and inclusive planning process that prioritize climate resiliency. And when we think about sea level rise, we tend to think just about building concrete infrastructure, but we have to be more thoughtful in how we elevate our city by building parks and playgrounds that help us with this. We can be very thoughtful and creative and very intentional in the way that we do this. Right now, we have too much that is impermeable and there is no place for the water to go. And we know that that impacts more than just our immediate coastline, that we feel it in our neighborhoods. We feel it into the South End and into Roxbury and into the interior neighborhoods of our city. And as a Dorchester native, I've seen the effects of that, both of the coastal flooding and what's happening in the midst of our neighborhoods. As mayor, we'll continue to learn from those lessons and apply thoughtful policy as a result.
Councilor Campbell.
So whether it is the seaport or of course flooding on Morrissey Boulevard, which is just near my district, of course the waterfront, there are a whole host of examples where the city has gotten it terribly wrong. And the city needs to take responsibility and ownership. I believe in accountability. And when you look at, with respect to these neighborhoods and flooding and development projects, you see organizations, for example, like the Children's Museum or residents or the aquarium or Boston Harbor Now out there on their own planning and developing resiliency strategies, having fundraising campaigns to come up with the money. That's all ridiculous. The city of Boston needs to take the lead. And when we talk about responding to issues of climate and resiliency, of course, it's looking at development, it's making sure our code is updated, that we are clear with respect to what we will allow to be built and what we will allow not to be built to create predictability and consistency. But the second piece that is critically important is making sure that as we are doing this building, as we are responding with creative ideas on dealing with climate, that we're also making sure our city is accessible. I live in Mattapan, and yet for many, the seaport, the waterfront feel like far away and not a part of their city. Accessibility, connectivity, critically important.
Chief Barras.
Thank you, David. There is a lot of work to be done in our waterfront. It starts with the seaport, but of course it's all of our neighborhoods. And as mayor, I'll make sure to accelerate our neighborhood level resilience planning that we've done through the Climate Ready Boston plan. We've worked with a lot of partners throughout the city. There is some really good planning that's been done, and now it's time to implement. We need to implement the plans in the South Boston waterfront and throughout our neighborhoods to protect the residents from climate impacts like flooding, storms, extreme heat, and power disruption. We also know, we've done an analysis that for every $1 billion that we could possibly invest, we'll save 19 billion, whether it's in the seaport or otherwise. And so that is the most important thing that we can do, is try to figure out implementation and how we finance implementation of all 55 of the resilient projects that we have in our Climate Ready Boston plan. We need to make sure that it gets done. It's time to look at the future in terms of what projections are, and then make sure that Boston's resilient and able to mitigate some of the impact of those projections.
Thank you. Mayor Janey, I know you said you don't want to point fingers, but I want to ask you a little bit more of a focused question. Aside from the seaport, what are some shortcomings of your predecessors on addressing the city's energy and environmental issues? And can you point to any failures or mistakes on their part that you hope to correct? And if so, what are they?
Well, I think we can always do better. So I think it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are doing better. You know, I have 3 grandchildren growing up in this city, and I want to make sure that they're able to raise their own grandchildren right here in this city if they choose to do so. You know, as mayor of Boston, I am making sure that we are leading on this front. As I mentioned, this is not just environmental justice, this is a racial justice issue. So in terms of new capital funding, we can make sure that 10% of that goes to open space, infrastructure, and facility projects that are climate resilient. There is money, an additional $1 million that I'm investing in terms of climate ready for the harbor and looking at ways so that we don't make the same mistakes of the past. Moving forward, we have an opportunity and our children are depending on us, our grandchildren are depending on us, and that is how I will continue to lead with them in mind moving forward and moving our city forward as mayor.
Thank you. Councilor Wu, to meet your goals to reduce emissions, we're going to need to entirely retrofit the city's homes and buildings to remove fossil fuels, an undertaking I've heard compared to the introduction of indoor plumbing. What will you do to accelerate that conversion and ensure that costs are not overwhelming for city residents? And when do you expect that to be complete?
We need to make sure, first of all, that we're not allowing for this problem to continue, that the permitting of new construction and new development meets the very aggressive standards that we have to be setting. And then when it comes to Boston's older housing stock, which is going to be a monumental task, ensuring that we're providing both the financing mechanisms and the fair labor, good wages, the people power to be able to get that done. So that's why I propose creating an urban conservation corps program and workforce development programs that will be based at Madison Park Vocational Technical High School. Boston should not just be dipping into this new green economy, but really shaping it, driving it, connecting our local residents to these opportunities to create the workforce that we need, close the racial wealth gap, and then help our residents. By financing it through programs like the Betterment Program, a PACE program that the state has created for other mechanisms where the public sector can help provide funding upfront and then residents pay that back over their water bills or others over a long period of time, that makes it much more accessible financially for everyone. This has to start with our most impacted communities.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell, as a lifelong resident of Boston, you know that we still have too many lead water pipes. The city has identified about 3,900 lead service lines with another 1,800 that still use unknown materials. What would you do to accelerate their removal?
Thank you, David, for the question. And when I talked about earlier, the importance of centering communities of color and particularly residents of color, this is one example of what I meant. So I'm currently a district councilor representing largely Dorchester, Mattapan. I still get calls, my team and I, about lead, about, of course, pollution and other things, but specifically lead issues. Number one, it's just greater investment. The city of Boston has a whole bunch of great, incredible plans and good plans, but the timelines, of course, are either not met or they're lagging. And so there is a way to offer up more investment through our budget process. And of course, pulling on the state, the federal government, philanthropy to invest in these infrastructure changes that we need. In addition, I call for a climate commission. So as we're making these changes, as we're pushing specifically in the lead context to be changing this infrastructure for residents, that we update the public along the way. Critically important, the biggest thing I hear from residents, the biggest frustration is, we see these plans, but what are you doing and how are you going to achieve them? This is a way to invite residents to be a part of that solution, hold us all accountable to getting it done. But we should not have to wait to some situation like we see in other states to get this right in the city of Boston.
Thank you. Councilor Savvy-George, in 50 years, summer temperatures in Boston are likely to exceed 90 degrees nearly every day, with temperatures higher in areas with more asphalt and less green space. One of the things climate scientists talk about is the need to reduce heat islands, which we've heard about a little bit about today. This has been a big problem in the city, as often the city's Department of Public Works prefers to pave over medians and other spaces rather than plant there. I've hectored your colleague, Councilor Matt O'Malley, about this happening in recent years in Jamaica Plains Hyde Square, where a renovation project left much of the circle in pavement where there could be planters. What will you do to ensure that we replace more concrete and asphalt with trees, planters, flowers, grass, or anything green?
No, it's a great question. It's so important to make sure that the city's residents have access to open space, to parks, to green space, but that at the same time, it's not just grass, that we are very much concerned and focused on growing, preserving and growing our tree canopy. We've seen the challenges with Melnia's trees and the work and the support that I've given to the Friends of Melnia Cass Boulevard on saving Melnia's trees. It's so important that we're making sure that we are preserving that tree canopy across the city, and making sure that we're allowing a greater education when we think about our young people in our schools to appreciate that growing tree canopy and to preserve it. As mayor, it is part of my goal to make sure that we are not just creating that green space, but growing that tree canopy across our neighborhoods, that it's not just happening in a few defined locations in response to conversations around development, that we are much more proactive in growing it, but then also thinking about the role that our urban forests play and creating that, just access for our residents and greater awareness.
We'll talk more about tree canopy in a bit. Chief Barros, what specifically will you do to improve biking in the city? For example, would you extend the Southwest corridor so there's a protected bike lane that connects with downtown?
Yeah, biking is really important in the city. As Chief of Economic Development, I've taken a number of trips around the globe to look at how other cities have planned for biking infrastructure, protective infrastructure, and then helping to build the culture for people to be able to adapt to that. It is important, in fact, that we continue to create protected biking infrastructure, but then we also talk to our small businesses about the importance of biking. Biking allows for more local economic development. People who are on bikes typically spend more money in our community main streets. And so I would be a champion for extending that bike corridor and making sure that our communities feel a part of that conversation and they understand the benefits that come with that conversation.
Thank you. Rep. Santiago, the cost of mortgage and flood insurance for homes and buildings in flood zones is likely to skyrocket in the coming years. In Boston, more than 3,000 properties a year will face a substantial risk of damage from flooding, and those losses are likely to exceed $62 million a year in the next 30 years, or 75% more than now, according to a recent report by the First Street Foundation. How will you address the surging costs of insuring homes and buildings?
No, David, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why we've said throughout this entire forum that climate justice isn't just racial justice or economic justice, it's also housing justice. And that needs to be addressed first and foremost. We are experiencing a rising sea level that needs to be addressed, and we need to make sure that we are investing in it appropriately. And with any new development in the city, whether it's the redevelopment of a neighborhood, certain parcels, we need to make sure that we are having climate resiliency standards put in place that are going to address that in the development, the construction, and any new infrastructure that takes place, because you're exactly right. If we don't address it now, in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's going to be addressed. And it's important that we invest in that type of development. Right now, as Mayor of Boston, I'm committed to doing that because, we need to. We don't have a choice. We need to be bold. We need to move with expediency and urgency. And as Mayor of Boston, I'll do that.
Thank you. Okay, we've reached our first lightning round where we'll ask you to answer yes or no to a question. We'll again go in alphabetical order, and I'm going to turn it over to Milton Valencia, my colleague, who will ask the lightning round questions.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. These are IE lightning round questions, no time review, but looking something really quick to the point, a yes or no question here. So we'll go in alphabetical order, which will start with Chief Barros, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Sabi George, Mayor Janey, Representative Santiago, Councilor Wu, And again, we're just looking to make this lightning like quick paces. So first off, would you support a citywide composting program that would provide composting buckets to every household in Boston? Chief Barrows.
Yes.
Councilor Campbell.
Yes, and we just had a budget hearing today talking about the city being delayed in making this happen.
Councilor Sabi George.
As someone who participates in composting here at home, yes, absolutely.
Mayor Janey.
Yes, as an avid gardener, absolutely. And as mayor, I've not composting, but in terms of recycling, just launched a new initiative where new recycle bins are made of plastic that has been gotten out of our oceans. And so really proud of that work as well.
Representative Santiago.
Yes, absolutely. We can't call ourselves a leader in this if we're not moving forward, and we have a lot of work to do, and I'm looking forward to leading that charge.
And Councilor Wu.
Yes, the Boston City Council has been trying to do this for more than 5 years. Shout out to Councilor Matt O'Malley. Important for our city budget too.
He's watching, I'm sure. Do you, next question, and we'll go reverse order now. Do you support making the tea free for all low-income residents in Boston? Councilor Wu.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. This is a public good. This is a social justice, economic justice, racial justice issue. Let's start with buses, go from there. We can make it happen.
Representative Santiago.
Great. I definitely support targeted investments in our low-income communities. I've been fighting for that for a long time. And as someone who takes the bus myself and who helped save Bus 43 in the city of Boston, I'm committed to making sure that low-income communities have access to the T.
Mayor Janey.
Yes, I don't own a car. I still take the T as mayor of Boston. I was just on the T Friday. And I am delivering a free bus now as mayor, connecting a major economic corridor from Mattapan Square to Grove Hall to Nubian Square. I'm launching that now as mayor of Boston.
Councilor Sabi George.
I think it's really important that the T and public transit as a public good remain good, and we need to continue to make investments in public transportation. So although I support the concept and the idea of a free T, we need to do it in a very limited and focused way, and then have discussions around proper investment to roll it out further.
Councilor Campbell.
I like to make commitments as an elected that I know I can keep, because it's a way to build trust with residents. So I committed to my transportation plan and my environmental plan to make buses free in the city of Boston, all routes, all buses. This is the equity issue that we could do in the city of Boston and make happen with the T and new investments.
And Chief Barrows.
Transit equity is important. Access to the transit system is really critical. That's why we need to make it as affordable and accessible to as many people as possible. But those of us who can pay should continue to invest in transit. Fares represent over $700 million a year. We need to continue to invest in our transit. I can pay for it. I will continue to pay for it. But for our low-income residents, we need to make sure that it's free and accessible. And there are certain bus lines that need to be free because the tracks show that, in fact, there are low-income families that need the T, and we should provide it.
Great. And just for time purposes, I really want to stick to that lightning round kind of theme. I do appreciate elaboration and kind of context, but just looking to be quick just for time. So next question, do you support rebuilding the bridge to Long Island? Chief Barrows.
Yes, absolutely.
Councilor Campbell.
Yes, as long-term, ferry service, a short-term solution.
Councilor Asabi George.
Yes, absolutely. I can't wait to get those shovels in the ground.
Mayor Janey.
Yes, but we can't wait on the bridge and continue to fight with Quincy, which is why I'm right now as mayor investing in a plan that will ensure that we can build up the island so it's self-sustaining and ferry service can work as a viable option.
Representative Santiago.
Yes, this is an urgent issue because we have people right now in the city of Boston suffering from homelessness and mental health and substance use issues, and that island is going to provide for that.
And Councilor Wu.
No, not in the short term. There are much more uses and more urgent ways to address this crisis with $100 million plus that it would inevitably take. And we haven't seen a clear plan for how this would plug into our city's opiate crisis. Better things to do with that funding.
As mayor, would you support legal action to prevent Eversource from building a $66 million electric substation in East Boston, which a few months ago received approval from the state's Energy Facilities Siting Board? Councilor Wu.
Yes, I've been proud to stand with residents and our local representatives on this for many years. This is another environmental hazard in a community that already bears far too many.
Representative Santiago.
Yes, I mean, the issue here is that these public hearings that have been had, they fail to incorporate any cultural language, accessibility. I mean, public outreach must be on the terms of the community, not the lawyers. And so, yes.
Mayor Janey.
Absolutely proud to stand with the East Boston residents. I did so just a few weeks ago. I will take any action to stand with them and to ensure that environmental issues don't continue to burden Black and Brown communities.
Councilor Asabi George.
Yes, absolutely. We know that the community was not a part of the process. And when we call something a community process, it's critical that the residents of East Boston were a part of it. And, we will stand in very close partnership with the residents of East Boston and protect them from this substation.
Councilor Campbell.
Yes, look forward to continuing to stand with the elected leadership there and the residents. This is one example of an environmental injustice we should all be standing up for and against what's happening in East Steve.
And Chief Barros.
Milton, it's an environmental justice issue. I've been standing up for them all my life, standing up to them beside residents as a partner. It will take legal action by the city, and I've been public in saying that I'm willing to act legally to make sure we can stop it.
Okay, we have two more. And again, just for context, if we could be quick so we can get to more audience questions. This year, in wake of reports about toxic chemicals known as PFAS being found in the pesticides used to prevent outbreaks of EEE, state officials are allowing municipalities to opt out of such spraying. A half dozen communities have already voted to do so, and another 10 have already begun the process to do so. Would you support Boston opting out? Chief Barros.
Yes, Milton, Boston should lead the way, in fact, on this and do more work immediately to opt out.
Councilor Campbell.
Yes.
Councilor Asabi George.
Yes.
Mayor Janey.
Yes.
Representative Santiago.
Yes.
And Councilor Wu.
Yes, any concentration of these dangerous chemicals is hazardous for health in our water supply. We need to take every action to stop this.
Great. And last question, as mayor, would you press the state to connect the red and blue lines of the T at the Charles MGH stop? Councilor Wu.
Absolutely. Now is the moment when there's a project already there. I've been testifying before the Fiscal and Management Control Board several times on this issue. I'll continue to press as mayor.
Representative Santiago.
Absolutely. We need better interconnectivity, better affordability, better accessibility, and I'm committed to doing so.
Mayor Janey.
Yes.
Councilor Asabi George.
Yes, I also am a proponent of the north-south rail link.
Councilor Campbell.
Yes, absolutely.
And Chief Barros.
Absolutely, Milton.
Great. That was a great round, and I just wanted to pass off to audience questions. So from there, I'm going to pass the podium to Ms. Elizabeth Henry.
Thank you, Milton. Well, the Q&A is flooded. Over 88 audience questions were submitted before and during the forum. And for candidates, I think what strikes me is how viewers want specifics on your priorities, and people also seem to like a lightning round format here. So I will start with 2 questions, 30 seconds tops each, and they're pulling from 2 of the top themes across all of those questions. And in both cases, I will be asking for your top policy priority on a given theme. So first, and I'm going to be scrambling the names here so that you each have a chance to go first and last. First, we know from our region's experience with, for instance, biotech and cannabis and the build out of the seaport, that while an industry may flourish, it doesn't necessarily mean that it grows equitably in Boston. So if elected, your administration will be tasked with fostering growth in the clean tech economy in Boston. What is your top policy priority for inclusive clean tech economic development? And I'd like to start with you, Acting Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much. You're absolutely right. We have to be much more intentional when it comes to equity. This is why I've invested $1 million in green jobs and making sure that there is a pipeline there. This is why I've been proud to lead in the cannabis industry, making sure that the regulation of this industry is in fact equitable. We have to do the same when it comes to tech.
And State Rep Santiago.
Look, we have a community in Boston. We have a thriving biotech community. We have a thriving cannabis community. The next wave is this green economy. And we have to make sure, particularly in our communities of color, that they have access to the education, to the opportunities. And I'm committed to doing that. The fact of the matter is right now, as a person of color who spent a number of years growing up in Boston, I didn't know much about the environment. There are still parts of Boston that are struggling to get access to education, to get opportunities. And I'm committed to make sure that those new jobs of the future, those green jobs, will be a part of the education system, the vocational opportunities in communities of color.
City Councilor Wu.
Boston has the potential over the next couple of years to create a whole new ownership structure, economic opportunity, and energy source through wind. We have space. We have some of the best wind in the world for this technology. It must be an equitable opportunity. Many billions of dollars will be put forward through this. We need to center our Black and Brown and women-owned business owners in this opportunity and connect our local residents to these jobs. So I'll focus on equitable procurement in the wind space.
Great. Chief Barros.
Thank you. There are three different areas that we need to focus on. We need to focus on green job creation and making sure that we can invest the workforce development dollars to get people to those jobs. I will immediately create a green jobs unit out of in the Boston Workforce Development Office. We also need to create a fund for capital for new startups. People of color owned, women of color owned startups in the city of Boston. And as we invest in retrofits, we need to make sure that the procurement goes to women and people of color owned businesses. We need to have clear goals, technical assistance, and working capital available.
Councilor Ivey-George.
As a city, we need to make sure that we are actually and literally investing in the green economy and the green workforce. In order to realize all of our climate goals, we need to ensure that our workforce is ready to take advantage of those job opportunities. Almost 80,000 jobs in Greater Boston will be in clean energy. On the council, I've been a strong advocate for expanding technical and vocational education in clean energy at Madison Park Technical Vocational High School. We need to make sure that as we look to grow our workforce, we are doing it with our city's residents. And the most easy and direct way to do that is in partnership with Madison Park.
Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the audience for the question. A few things. One is, it's not lost on me that we are still in COVID and people are losing jobs. I think right now there's a way to accelerate some capital projects, accelerate projects within the green economy. And we use it, of course, broadly to get people back to work and prioritizing workers in communities of color, environmentally just communities, and also small businesses run by women and people of color. Going forward, green collar training programs, BPS, working with our unions, of course, in community colleges to create greater partnerships here, and doing more to invest in small businesses run by immigrants, people of color, and women, also critically important.
All right, so second question, and then I will be closing with a lightning round before passing it back to the Globe team. Second question relates to buildings. Buildings represent the single largest source of emissions in the city of Boston. According to the Carbon Free Boston report, 85% of the square footage that will exist in 2050 has already been built. So I'd like to get specific on that 85%. What is your top policy priority for retrofitting existing buildings, including homes and businesses? And let's begin with you, with Councilor Ivey-George.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. And when we think about the work that has to be done around retrofitting buildings that already exist, we have to do it in partnership with private developers and commercial building owners. We have to do it with them. We cannot just lead, it has to be done in partnership. And as a priority as mayors, bring them to the table so that we can figure out a path to completion, to making sure that our infrastructure, our built environment around us is reflective of those goals when we think about Boston leading in climate preparedness and readiness.
Councilor Wu.
My top priority is equity. We need to ensure that it's not just those who can afford to do those retrofits themselves right now, having the protections against increased flooding and heat and rising energy costs. We need to democratize the ability to benefit from this. That's why creating a city-funded urban conservation corps will provide that workforce, close gaps for our training, and also make sure that our residents can access that financially as well.
Chief Barros.
Making sure that our buildings are carbon neutral are critical. The existing stock, it's really important. That's why I would build on the work that I've done with Renewable Boston Trust. I personally presented opportunities for private building owners throughout the city to work with the city to fund tax exempt leases, or to fund up through energy efficiencies that they would save later. And so as the mayor, I would continue to invest in the Renew Boston Trust, work with the private sector and homeowners to finance retrofitting in the city of Boston. It's the only way to do it.
Councillor Campbell?
It's just that, moving up the timeline and greater investment. Of course, looking at our own city infrastructure, not just our buildings. We've been talking a lot about just city operations as a whole, and we're behind with respect to, I think, where we would want to be as a city. So greater investment. I do think the piece that is critical, and I have heard this when I was developing my environmental plan and transportation plan, they go hand in hand. Many of the conversations came from landlords, small landlords, residents, in the need for greater resources in the city of Boston to help them do that on some of these smaller projects. I think that's critically important in a way that the city of Boston can be more innovative and creative.
Representative Santiago?
One of my top environmental priorities is to get us to net zero building emissions by 2035. My administration is going to focus on 4 things. 1, making sure that any new development is using sustainable building materials, that we're promoting high efficiency infrastructure in the city of Boston, and that we're requiring buildings here to prepare for the electric grid. As mayor, I'm going to work with the developers to plan for a green power grid, by installing solar panels and moving to more efficient systems like heat pumps, instead of this fossil fuel industry, which we have to get away from.
And Acting Mayor Janey?
The first priority is to start with our own buildings. That is the work that is underway now. We are planning for public buildings right now, but we have to look at all buildings in the city of Boston when it comes to retrofitting, and it has to be done in a thoughtful way, and it has to be done in an equitable way. There has to be support and resources available, particularly to protect smaller landlords who have older homes, who also need to deal with their housing. But we're going to start right now with the city's building stock.
All right, and one last lightning round question. Thank you to a viewer for submitting this just a few minutes ago. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all important, and 10 being your most important issue, where does environment fall in the list of issues that you're running on and that you will focus on as mayor? Chief Barros, let's start with you.
It's 10. In anything we do, housing, schooling, economic development, we've got to make sure that environmental justice and climate justice is central.
Councillor Saibi George.
Climate certainly needs to be a priority in everything that we do as a city, but we need to make sure that it is at the right nexus point when we think about affordability, when we think about accessibility, when we think about community voice. I would say 8.
Representative Santiago.
10, because we have to understand the intersectionality of climate. Climate justice, again, is economic justice, is transit justice, is racial justice, and we can't pick and choose this. They're all one, and we have to have a comprehensive answer to each and every one of those.
Councillor Wu.
10. Climate justice is racial and economic justice. That's why I'm proud to have put forward a city-level Green New Deal that's comprehensive and ensures that we are addressing every facet of this with every voice in the conversation.
Acting Mayor Janey.
As I said at the opening, climate justice is racial justice. It's economic justice. These issues are deeply personal for me and how I want to lead the city forward with a lens toward equity. So absolutely 10.
And Councillor Campbell.
Absolutely 10, because if we don't get this right, it intersects with public health, it intersects with transportation, livelihood. People are dying. And just the data around life expectancy from Back Bay to Roxbury, 59, if you're lucky to make it to and back in the Roxbury, Back Bay, of course, you're probably making it into your 90s. This is about life and death, but I do think the language we use has to be expansive to include more communities, especially communities of color.
Thank you. So back to you, David and Milton.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And we are 2/3 of the way through. We have about a half hour more of questions. Hopefully you can all stick with us. I'm going to ask 3 more questions for each of the candidates, and then Milton will have another short lightning round, and then we'll go to closing statements. Okay, this is for everyone. As mayor, you'll have to make many difficult decisions, sometimes choosing between competing interests and similarly vital needs. I wrote a story for the paper recently about a difficult case in Franklin Park concerning the future of the Shattuck site and whether it would be reclaimed as parkland, or whether it should be reclaimed as parkland as intended by Frederick Law Olmsted, or used for supportive housing or other social services. At the moment, it doesn't seem like the services can be moved to the Arbor Way bus yard as open space advocates have called for. Where do you come down on this issue? And how would you approach this if you're mayor and the state decides to proceed with its plan to build the housing? Okay, we'll start with Chief Barros.
Thanks for the question, David. You're right. As mayor and as someone who has helped to lead the city in the last 7 years, there are difficult questions to make, but your priorities have to be clear. And as mayor, I would make sure that we prioritize the urgency of the moment, make sure that we have the services for the residents that we need, that we are able to provide transitional housing and services and some dormitory services at the Shattuck. But then we need to put a long-term program and plan in place to return that back to our natural assets in the city. That's what it was intended to do, and that's what we should aim for. But right now, we need to provide those services.
Councilor Campbell.
Thank you for the question. And I have to tell you, anytime I hear the Shattuck, it gets personal for me, because at one point in time, my twin brother was housed there. On the top of the Shattuck, there is a jail unit, and was deteriorating in his health before he ultimately passed away, of course. And so I often have been in conversations with folks early on about this space being used for supportive housing or to help those who are most vulnerable. That being said, there has been more discussion of late from residents on some of these other purposes that are needed. And so I'm engaging with residents. I think everything I do is always grounded in what I hear. And so there are more conversations in the latter space that are just coming forward. In my district role, I have heard about the Shattuck, of course, and people pushing for more housing, more supportive programming, but it's an ongoing conversation and I'll make a thoughtful decision. But as of right now, I have heard more with respect to its use for supportive housing and helping us with the opioid crisis, but we'll continue to engage folks on the latter pieces.
Councilor Sabi-George.
As an at-large city councilor, as someone who chaired a committee once known for its focus on homelessness, mental health, and recovery, I have been very much a part of the conversation around the planning of the Shattuck. And this is where we do find that conflict between focusing on climate justice, focusing on homelessness, focusing on those experiencing substance use disorder, those experiencing mental health issues, and those in need of housing stability. The Shattuck can do all of those things, and think about the aspect of green space and maintaining a certain level of green space, but also responding to the very specific needs of our residents who are in crisis. Hundreds of people live on the street every single night that need supportive wraparound housing and certain stability in their lives. The Shattuck and that campus brings that to the people of Boston. I support that effort. I support that work for the long term.
Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much. You know, these are all very, very important issues and many issues that are in crisis. And, you know, it's unfortunate that they continue to be pitted against each other. Certainly we need housing for folks who are unhoused. Certainly we need services for those with substance use disorder. And certainly we need to be protecting all of our green space. When it comes to the Shattuck, when it comes to Franklin Park, you know, there is more conversation to be had. It is not clear to me that there aren't other options available, but I am certainly continuing to listen and to hear what residents and what advocates have to say on this important issue. Again, we need to get to a place where we can support all of these things because they are all very, very important.
Rep. Santiago.
Well, long before COVID-19 was here, we've had an epidemic of our very own. It's an epidemic at the nexus of opioid use, mental health illness, and homelessness. And I see it very well because I live just a couple blocks from there and I treat patients from Mass and Cass each and every day. I've been a proponent of putting more services at the Shattuck grounds, but it's important that we take a more holistic look at this, right? Franklin Park is somewhere above, 500 acres, right? Shattuck is 13 acres. And, if you're not, if you want to change what's going on. I'd suggest looking at the zoo or looking at the Franklin or the golf course and perhaps changing that into green space that is more publicly available. But the fact of the matter is, people are dying right now in our streets, in my hospital room, in my ER, and they need services, right? And we need to use this as an option. Again, just 13 acres to provide those broad range of continuum of care services. That's short-term recovery beds, which we need the most right now in Boston.
Councilor Wu.
It is so rare in a city that is as developed and dense as Boston to have the chance, a generational opportunity to think about two publicly owned parcels in relative proximity to each other and on relatively similar timelines for development. The latest public meeting about the Arborway Yards showed that the timeline was much closer than anyone had been saying to that of the Shattuck. And we know that we can't make informed decisions about these very important trade-offs in silos, in a vacuum. So as mayor, I would ensure that the city is driving the conversation between DCAM, which is managing one part of it, and the MBTA, which is managing the other silo of it, to have one full conversation. This is not a situation where we should be putting Band-Aids on our problems in a way that actually lead to even further greater cost in the long run. So let's have that full planning conversation and ensure that we are making the right trade-offs with community members at the table.
Thank you. Disposal and recycling costs in Boston have increased for residential waste to more than $25 million a year, and they're unlikely to decline anytime soon. Most of the trash is burned in incinerators, and much of the recyclables aren't actually getting recycled for a host of complicated reasons. What steps would your administration take to address this problem? Let's start with Councilor Wu now.
This is connected to our composting question earlier, that it is a major budget issue for the city of Boston to continue how we are going now, a contract that is not only growing more expensive given the national and international situations and markets, but also the situation on our streets and how complicated it is with greater traffic to be picking up everything in certain windows. So we need to be shifting so that there is household composting, that there's regular pickup of recyclable, of yard waste on a regular basis all throughout the year as well. And that we are empowering not just pilots here and there, but the city of Boston to really move to a new system of modeling everything that we are asking our residents to do as well. When it comes to food waste in our schools and in our public buildings, we need to be taking every step to ensure that we are having as close to a zero waste model within our own city departments, and then making that possible with technical assistance and the contracts that we are setting to make that available for residents across every neighborhood as well.
Rep. Santiago.
Great. I mean, you're absolutely right, David. I mean, this is a significant issue that impacts every household in the city of Boston, right? Not just in terms of our tax money going towards that, in terms of our ability to do that. I live in a very dense part of Boston, right? I live in a small apartment on the third, fourth floor of a building, right? And the fact of the matter is that communities where I live, where I'm from, don't have access or don't have much knowledge when it comes to composting. That's why I look very much forward to putting in place a composting program where every household in the city of Boston can participate, can get educated, can have access to. But that's going to require visionary leadership. That's going to require funding and a bit of technical assistance. And we're committed to doing that because we need to get this city to a zero waste city as soon as possible. I mean, we know what's at stake if we don't do that, and I'm committed to doing that as the mayor of Boston.
Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, really proud to launch new recycle bins in the city of Boston, the first in the nation that is making recycle bins out of completely recycled material from waste in the ocean. We need to do much more. I too live in a very dense part of the city. I live in Roxbury. There are lots of big apartment buildings that don't have space for recycling, that may not have green space and feel the need to compost. We can do a lot more. We can invest more. We can do much more in terms of informational campaigns in the city of Boston. And that is what I am doing and will continue to do as mayor of Boston.
Councilor Asabi George.
We know the growing expense that both trash and recycling and composting brings to our city, but we also know the benefits of a really good education plan. We need to make sure that we are continuing to market and educate both broadly when we think about our residents across the city of Boston, when we think about consumers in the city of Boston, when we think about our commercial, especially our larger scale property owners, commercial property owners across the city of Boston. It's the small stuff, it's the PR, it's the campaigning, it's the social media awareness. It's also about investing in science and civics education. When we think about our young people, we think about the adults and the homeowners and the residents of tomorrow. We need to make sure that we are working across the board when we think about all of the pieces that are so important to making sure that we are reducing trash and making sure that we are educating our public on the importance both of recycling, of proper trash disposal, and composting.
Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, David, for the question. And it literally was a topic of discussion today during our Public Works budget hearing. And definitely shout out to Councilor O'Malley, who's been leading the way on the council side on getting these things done for years. And frankly, pushing the city to move up its timelines on the composting project. You know, Project Oscar was talking about today, and there were some commitments over the years as to making that happen sooner. That just sort of fell by the wayside. But kudos to some of our departments who are recognizing the importance of educating the average lay resident on the importance of recycling, composting, how we get rid of our waste. I think that part is critically important. We do not do enough of that. How might we be creative and think outside the box in terms of our larger landlords, management companies, and others helping us play a role in that education campaign? And then the last piece is outside of greater investment in the education piece, just making it more accessible to folks. And there is a way to do that in the city of Boston. We've been talking about it. There's some great ideas in an existing plan. It's speeding up the timeline with greater investment.
Chief Barros.
David, thank you for the question. We need to make sure that we keep the city's 2019 zero waste plan. It needs to be implemented. We said it earlier, we need to increase composting. And we need to make sure that people have education and information around recycling. 36% of what is thrown away, in fact, is compostable. 39% of what is thrown away is recyclable. But on the other side, we need to make sure that people are using recyclable products. That I was proud to support businesses as we transitioned and implemented the ban on plastic bags. We need to do the same in every area of city life. We need to try to eliminate the use of plastic bottles. We need to make sure that we're using recyclable goods. We need to work with BPS and others in the city to make sure that as we educate, we're providing different ways for people to consume or different material that's better on our environment.
Great, thank you. More than a decade ago, Mayor Menino stood in Dorchester Park and vowed that Boston would plant 100,000 new trees by 2020, expanding the city's tree canopy by 20%. But the city has barely kept up with tree mortality. Between 2008 and 2017, the last years I have figures for, the city planted 9,809 street trees and removed 5,815, a net gain of fewer than 4,000 trees. Around the same time as Menino's pledge, New York City set a goal to plant 1 million trees by 2017, and it met its goal 2 years early. As mayor, what would you do to substantially increase the city's tree canopy? Where would you plant the trees? And will you make a pledge for a specific amount you'll plant your first term? We'll start with Chief Barros.
Thank you, David. As mayor, we need to protect what we have first and then grow. The residents of Roxbury most recently were clear. There's no need to try to improve Melania Cast so people could just drive through our neighborhood and not even stop. And so we were going to cut trees to make that happen. And it was clear the city officials listened and stopped that. We need to make sure that we're protecting the trees that we have. And then we need to use things like our institutional master plan and development to make sure that as we are growing, that people are providing more trees and canopy coverage in our city. This needs to be the way that we grow the city in a smart and sustainable way.
Councilor Campbell.
This is a topic of discussion, of course. It's happening, I feel like, every day, whether it's the conversation in Charlestown, of course, the conversation related to Melania Cast, Lenox Street housing development where I grew up down the street, there were residents who were in uproar about trees being cut down where there was no community process. So it really does need to be the city of Boston, again, taking the lead in making sure that every development proposal, every conversation related to something new, that we are establishing a process that is crystal clear as to how we're going to protect existing trees, how we're going to expand, of course, the tree canopy. That doesn't exist right now. So it's an ad hoc response, which is unacceptable. In addition, you know, I know the value of the planting of trees. Franklin Field housing and development in my district hasn't been touched in 30 years. We're expanding the parks and access to green space there. I was there planting trees. We really need to couple it with the conversation around how we expand access to parks and green spaces, which also, there are many communities, of course, that are facing park deserts in the city of Boston, and that too is unacceptable when we think about what climate will look like in the future.
Councilor Asabi-George.
Certainly, our tree canopy is a little bit more than just our parks and our green spaces. We know how important it is on Melnia-Cass. We know how important it is in Charlestown. We know how important it is in East Boston, where I spent many years coaching softball from a park that spent the day looking at the ass end of airplanes coming and going. And it's so important that when we think about our tree canopy, that we are talking about the public health emergency, which is related to asthma, which has impacted and affected asthma rates and diabetes rates and obesity rates across our city, that we are looking at our parkways and our boulevards, that we are looking at our side streets, and that when we think about sidewalk design, that we're also including tree conversations around it, and that we're protecting our urban wilds, that we are protecting what already exists and looking to grow it in small ways and in big ways alike. Sometimes we think about the big, broad brushstrokes that we can make when sometimes it's those small little moves that really impact and create a better city for all, especially when we think about our tree canopy across our city.
Mayor Janey, and I just want to ask for any more specificity. In a normal interview, I would be pressing you all for far more specificity, but I've been hanging back reluctantly. But Mayor Janey, can you be more specific in just in terms of numbers, just to have something that would be easy for viewers to actually wrap their head around?
Thank you, David. So I was very proud to stand with activists, with residents in their fight around Melnia. When I was on the other side of City Hall, I led on that issue, sponsored the hearing, and we got the city, the former administration, to back off when it came to removing the trees on Melnia-Cass Boulevard. This is an important issue, as my neighborhood has several heat islands, and I think it all just comes down to political will. Right now, unfortunately, we live in a time where every green parcel that exists in our city, people want to build upon it. We certainly are in a housing crisis and we need more housing, but we also have to balance that with ensuring that we have open space, that we have green space, that we're investing in our parks. This isn't just environmental justice issues. This is also economic justice. By planting of trees, that is an opportunity to contract with small businesses. We are seeing that specifically in Malcolm X Park and the leadership that I brought to bear there in terms of a procurement opportunity and doubling the investment there from 5 million in this capital plan to 9.4 million. When it comes to tree canopy overall, we certainly can do better than previous administrations and will do better than previous administrations when it comes to investing in our neighborhoods, investing in green space with actual dollars, giving people the opportunity to have jobs in this space. And I will continue to lead on that front.
Rep Santiago, and you guys get extra points for more specificity.
Well, I live about a 3-4 minute walk from Melnia-Cass, right? And one of the first meetings I took as an elected official was with the Friends of Melnia to save those trees. And I'm glad we got it done. And so as mayor, one of the first things I'm going to do in my first 30 days is to really order a study to look at the heat islands across the city and to get a full census of the existing trees within the city of Boston, right? And then we're going to use this data, working alongside community activists and leaders, to create comprehensive plans to address those heat islands and to really increase green space all across the city of Boston, right? And so, I mean, not only do I want to work on this plan to augment our tree program in the city of Boston, but I want to invest in tree planting and really prioritize it in some of our most underserved communities. And with respect to specifics, David, I think it's important that we do that in conjunction with the community. I'm no expert. I got 1 million years in education, 1 million years of experiences all around the world, but I know what I don't know. I'm interested in bringing people involved to the table to work with one another to solve these very complex issues. That's what I've done my entire life, and it's what I'll do as a mayor of Boston.
Councilor Wu.
I'm so proud that Boston has a growing clean tech industry, but it's clear that the most effective technology we have for climate is trees in terms of reducing emissions, providing shade, contributing to temperature and mental health benefits, all of that. So I'll put a specific number out there, which is that Boston has about 30-some thousand, between 30, 35,000 street trees. Many of these are next to open, empty pits where the holes already are, but the trees have not been replaced. We need to at least reach that doubling, 30,000 more trees over the first term. But I will say there actually is a plan. We completed our city's urban canopy tree assessment already, and now are in the process of forming a formal urban forestry plan. So I hope we will go far beyond that baseline, but it's clear that we need to not just think about what the city can do on sidewalks and on city parklands, but on private property, we need to be much more intentional as well about preserving the trees, not losing them in large batches. And we should never have a Melnia Cast situation again, where the community has to fight for a decade to be heard, wrap themselves full body around our trees in order to protect them and understand we don't have to choose between climate and transportation and other important priorities.
Thank you. I agree. There's nothing that bothers me more than seeing those empty pits as the environment reporter for the paper. I'm turning it over to Milton, and we're going to do another lightning round. You'll each have 20 seconds to answer these questions. Milton.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And again, we're looking for more than a yes/no question, but a little bit of brevity if we could. If you could cite a solar farm or more solar in the city or more wind turbines or another form of renewable energy, where would you put them and why? And we'll go in reverse our order. So Councilor Wu.
There's a lot of places where we should be adding solar on top of all of our municipal buildings. There's one that I would do tomorrow, which I think about every time I have to drive to City Hall, which is right in the patch along 93. There are many places where there's a little, actually a medium-sized patch of grass everywhere that there's publicly owned land that's not being used. Let's make sure we're doing that right away.
Representative?
Any new building that is built in the city of Boston, particularly if it's public and ones that are already built, need to have solar panels, right? I mean, we in the State House passed a bill to increase our procurement of wind energy, almost doubled, right? We need to be focusing on the waterfront here and making sure that we can increase the access to solar and wind energy in the city of Boston.
Mayor Janey.
There's a real opportunity. Every community meeting you go to, there's a debate around parking. So I'd like to see more solar arrays going up on some of our municipal lots so that we can get some energy that way. There's a good example at RCC, and we should do more of that in our city.
Councilor Sabi George.
I'd say all of our school buildings across the city of Boston, we've got 125 in our portfolio as we are underway with our Build BPS plan. And as mayor, I will continue to invest in our school buildings. On top of those buildings should be solar arrays and turbines.
Councilor Campbell.
I was going to say what she said, but in addition to school infrastructure, also our vacant lots and municipal lots. I've been leading a project looking at city-owned vacant lots. Some are massive in scope and size, where we could think creatively and outside the box.
And Chief Barris.
Yeah, Milton, the solar panels and wind are critical. I'm agreeing with my colleagues here. We need to use all public assets that we can to try to make it available for new energy sources. So it's school buildings, municipal buildings, and then the open spaces, open lots for wind.
And on that note, alternative to development, if you could wave a mayoral wand, so to say, to create new green space in the city, name one place where it would be, and what would you do with the land? So we'll start from the top, Chief Barros.
Thank you, Milton. Mine is clear. I think we need to create a new open space, a new park right there where the Harbor Garage sits. It's a super opportunity for the city to make a statement. And then I think the garage, which is needed, the parking is needed for the residents, it's needed for the aquarium, needs to go underground. In order for us to do that, we need to create economic value by moving the development rights to a different part of our city, and then creating a building there, working with John Shafar and his team to provide economic value that would put the parking underground and create new open space with a modest building in front of the aquarium.
Great. And just sticking to the lightning round, if we could, Councilor Campbell.
I would look at, frankly, where I have attempted to already activate city-owned lots. So certain parts of Mattapan, southern part of Dorchester, just places where there is currently a void in access to green space and where residents have been pushing for activation. There are a whole host of projects that could be activated by the city right away.
Councilor Asabi George.
We need to continue to hold true to our commitment around Boston's Harbor Walk, and we need to make sure that we are creating access points from all of our neighborhoods to the city's waterfront.
Mayor Janey.
In addition to the Harbor Garage, I would say the current location of the proposed substation in East Boston, there is a park right there next door. There's the Chelsea Creek. It is a perfect opportunity to open up and create more green space.
Representative.
One, we need to improve our living shoreline. I mean, we have 43 miles of waterfront, and it needs to be open and accessible to everyone in the city of Boston. I think we need to focus on the I-90 Austin interchange and expand access to the Charles. I mean, we have the Bowker overpass. We can do that as well. I mean, to daylight the Muddy River and make sure that people have access to it, and that can create some green space as well.
Councilor Wu.
In terms of places where I think we've made a mistake and should go back, I would call out the properties near the Allendale Woods, a development that would have been stopped if our Boston Wetlands Ordinance were already in effect at that point, nearby a very important natural resource area. And we need to make sure that we're strengthening connections into all of our valuable large parks, Franklin Park and that whole area, parks in every neighborhood. But there are places where we have gotten it wrong.
And to close this out with one final question, the Green Ribbon Commission. Can you tell me about it? The Green Ribbon Action Plan for the city. Have you read it? Yes or no? And if so, what's the one vital takeaway that you took from it? So we'll start from the bottom again, Councilor Wu.
Yes, I'm proud to be in contact with the Green Ribbon Commission and to have attended their study tour several years ago in Northern Europe, where we saw firsthand what took place and some of the innovations that other cities have. The major takeaway is that we need to be putting together the financing for large-scale protections. Boston should be thinking about how we get to that scale of thinking about our harbor, and we need the mechanisms now to put that financing in place.
Representative?
That's it. I haven't read the full plan yet, but looking forward to working with community leaders and activists who are committed to environmental justice and green space in the city of Boston.
Mayor.
So I'm reviewing along with my team. I'm proud again of my new chief of environment, energy, and open space, and the work that we will do moving forward to ensure that we are protecting our planet and future generations.
Councilor Asabi George.
I have not read the Green Ribbon Commission report in its full entirety, but I do think it's so important that we continue that work, that we make sure that the right partners are at the table, whether it's from private sector, institutional sector, but most important that our community members are at the table with this work, that they are centered to the work that we are doing as a city.
Councilor Campbell.
Yes, and actually did it when developing my environmental plan with a whole host of stakeholders to try to be intentional. I will say, I think the thing that is probably reflective just on this Zoom conversation is how important it is that we invite residents and the average resident to be a part of these conversations, to understand the financing piece, why it's critically important, because right now the average voter and the average resident does not. And so that's our work in the city of Boston.
And Chief Barris.
Thanks, Milton. Green Ribbon Commission is super important. The plan talks with them and listening to them. One of the recommendations that they've made that I would immediately adopt as mayor of Boston is they've asked for a higher level coordination of climate actions by the city. I would name a chief of resilience as mayor of Boston to make sure we had that coordination. It makes a lot of sense. We've got good departments doing good work, but the coordination could be used between Boston Water and Sewer. It could be used between the Public Works Department, BPDA, as we look at Berto and other things. We need to have greater coordination at the city, and I think the Green Commission is right.
Great. any final thoughts you can get into your closing statements, which I think are coming, but I want to turn it over to David, who will, I think, bring it in.
Thanks, Milt. Yeah, let's just go quickly into closing statements. We're running short on time. Councilor Campbell, you'll each have a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I was like, I think I got to go to the next Zoom. We all have a budget hearing. But thank you so much for hosting this conversation and providing, frankly, us an opportunity to talk about not only how critically important it is that we address the issues of climate and the environmental injustices that exist in the city of Boston, but that we do it with a sense of urgency. And I've always led in such a way that it includes everybody, including communities of color, which is critically important to me. I've always led with a sense of urgency and action because for me, this work is personal. It is about not wasting time. And I think my record as a council president of having the most aggressive agenda be done and implemented and accomplished really speaks to that. That won't change, that leadership will continue. If folks want to learn more about my plans, please do visit andreacampbell.org. They are specific, they are practical, they are doable. And most importantly, hope to earn the support of folks not only on this Zoom, but also, of course, in the city of Boston. So thank you guys so much.
Mayor Janey.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking you, David, Milton, and Elizabeth, certainly ELM and the Globe. Very, grateful for this opportunity to sit and discuss very important issues. As I said at the onset, climate justice issues are also racial justice issues and economic justice issues. In terms of racial justice issues, we see all of the ways that poor communities of color have been overly burdened, taking on certain injustices. Economic justice, we have a way out. We have a path forward in terms of green jobs. We have an opportunity to lead better in this city. I am grateful for my team that is in place and the work that we are currently doing, the investments that we are making. I certainly involve and engage community and invite more people to come in to do this work together. It is so important for our future. It's so important for our planet. And I certainly hope to engage more folks and earn the support of folks who are watching, and certainly encourage folks to visit my website at mayorjaney.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wu.
Thank you so much to ELM and to the Globe for convening us today. When I think about the urgency of climate change, I think back often to 2 summers ago, when I was standing on the basketball courts at the Josiah Quincy Upper School, convening a press conference with awful news that across the state of Massachusetts, the community with the greatest air pollution, where residents were exposed to the most harmful air quality, was right there in Chinatown. And as we were standing there in the space where we encourage our young people to go every day to breathe in that air as they're exercising and growing and learning, you can look up and see the impacts of our decisions. Highways ringed all around, filled with stalled cars, which are right back on the streets now after the pandemic, spewing pollution into the air. Our communities, especially environmental justice communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, deserve immediate action. We need to aim big. I'm proud to be pushing for a Boston city level Green New Deal and to have the vision and the track record to build coalitions to get this done.
Thank you, Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, everyone, for having us here today. We know that the climate emergency is here and now, and we need a mayor who will not only start on day one to fight for a more sustainable future, but who will ensure that that fight starts with our community and continues past just the conversation on climate. As mayor, I will lead and deliver on climate action through a community-based approach, because that's what I'm doing now on all issues as a city councilor at large. I will continue to be, as your mayor, present and accessible. I will continue to uplift the voices and let experiences of our residents inform and drive the agenda. And I will bring us together to continue to find real solutions to all of the problems that we face as a city. It will take each and every one of us to combat this crisis, whether it's by cutting emissions, investing in green jobs, and promoting a green economy, or preparing our coastlines for sea level rise. I'm ready to do that hard work hand in hand with you as your mayor.
Thank you, Chief Barros.
Thank you, David. I want to first thank you, EML, the Globe, Milton, and everybody who's put this together. Growing up in Roxbury, I remember going to the hospital and the doctor telling my mother that I had high level of lead, and I didn't know what that meant. But I was at risk, and my neighborhood was and is at risk. Environmental justice is really important, has always been important. That's why, as Executive Director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, we started a clean lots program to make sure, in fact, that if people are going to, be able to grow food, and we're going to promote urban agriculture, that it was going to be safe. As mayor, I'll make sure that we have the policies to unite our environmental justice communities with this larger conversation about climate justice. Climate justice is public health policy, it's public safety policy, transportation policy, economic policy, human rights policy, racial justice policy. I'll make sure that we have strategies to keep residents in their homes and protect our neighborhoods and create accessible open space so that we can be more resilient and have more adaptation. I'll make sure that we create efficient, cleaner buildings for our employees and residents. And I'll make sure that we pave the way for economic boosts across all industries, for green jobs and for startups in our neighborhood, so that Boston is resilient, so Boston is ready, and then we're not contributing to the disasters that are yet to come in terms of extreme weather.
Thank you. Rep. Santiago.
Thank you again to ELM and to the Globe for hosting this important conversation. Again, climate change is the existential threat, right, to our city, to our state, to our country. And I'm going to provide the bold leadership that we need in these pivotal times, because climate justice, as I said during this forum, is economic justice. Climate justice is transit justice. Climate justice is racial justice. And we need to implement policies that adopt this framework, right? And nowhere was that more evident than during COVID-19. When I took care of patients of color, who were significantly more at risk of dying just because they suffered from asthma and they lived in crowded housing located in polluted neighborhoods, right? That is not the way it should be, Not only that, but it was an insult to injury because they'd never been at the table with respect to EJ issues, right? They were more at risk simply because their communities were defined by environmental injustice. So as we address climate change, I want to make sure that those most vulnerable communities are at the table, because we need to beat the state's 2050 goal of climate neutrality. We need to prioritize the EJ issues, and we need to continue to increase climate resiliency infrastructure all across the city of Boston. And as mayor, I'm committed to getting that done with you, alongside you, and fighting for you each and every day. So thank you again, and I look forward to earning your vote in September.
Great. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us. We deeply appreciate it. Just a note, as the environment reporter at the Boston Globe, if anyone has a story who's listening in that they think is an important environmental story to be told, please find me and share it with me. And good luck, all of you guys, with the rest of your campaign. Signing off on behalf of the Boston Globe and ELM. Be well.
Have a nice afternoon, everyone.